From Genesis to Revelation, women in the Bible have struggled to receive the same amount of recognition as their male counterparts. This is a problem that has persisted into the 21st century and still affects women in the church today. We wanted to speak to a few women who have influential roles in religious settings and see how sexism still affects them today.
So I usually find it in kind of very slight ways. It's not always overt, but if I get a call at the office and somebody says, is the pastor there? And I say, this is she. And they'll say, oh, we're so happy to talk to you, but can we talk to the lead pastor? And so sometimes that's just a slight thing. They're not trying to hurt my feelings, but they assume that I wouldn't be the lead, that I wouldn't be the one in control or the lead pastor. So if I go to the hospital to make a visit for parishioners, I almost always wear my collar. Whereas my male colleagues, they don't wear their collars because they're much more likely to be trusted that they're there to visit a patient. Whereas for me, they'd be like, well, wait, what are you doing here? Who are you?
So I finished my degree and I got married and we went to a church that hired my husband, who was a business major, to be the youth pastor. And when we arrived, they just had a lay person doing their music. And so he said, well, Larry's going to be the youth pastor. Why don't we just have Lynn do the music ministry at our church? He was leading congregational singing and helping put the worship services together and leading the choir. And the pastor said, well, we can't do that because Lynn is not allowed to stand on the platform as a woman. But she could direct the choir because that's down on the lower level. It's not on the platform, it's down here. So I'll allow Lynn to lead the choir, but she's not going to do anything with the congregational singing from up here. And this man felt so bad, the layman who suggested it. He came to me afterwards and said, I'm so sorry. And he said, I'm going to, get up there and I had taken conducting courses. I remember watching him conducting these songs in the wrong time and meter and everything else, and it drove me crazy. But I don't know, I'm sure I was not always okay with it, but I am okay with it now, with what happened. It was it was just this pastor. It was just only what he knew. It was only what he understood about women in ministry, even though he was a Nazarene.
So I was traveling with E&C as a representative of the college after I graduated for one of the summer men teams. And as the representative, every church I went to, I set up the booth of E&C and I gave the speech that was come to E&C. And in Virginia, I was told I was not going to be giving that speech. And I thought oh, they must just not have time. Eventually they explained that they needed one of the male team members to give that speech. And neither of the male team members were representatives. They were I don't know what that speech is. I didn't understand. And they actually stopped talking to me. They started going to the male team members to plan it. They were uncomfortable with the male team members were uncomfortable with it. I was certainly offended and shocked. So I made the decision that E&C just would not be represented at that camp. I just thought that this doesn't represent E&C either for them to do that. And it really threw me because I hadn't been treated like that, and it does speak, I think, to culture. We were only going through New England and Northeast churches, and all of a sudden we get below the Mason-Dixon line and there's this weird sexism, and I had no idea that it even existed.
So my favorite story is the woman at the well that you find in the Gospel of John. And I don't know if you know the story, but so Jesus comes to the well and there's this woman and they have this conversation, and then she drops her bucket and runs away and goes to the town to tell people the good news. And I love that mainly because, one, Jesus is talking to a woman. And it's a woman that other people either were afraid to talk to or weren't necessarily wanting to talk to, and there's Jesus, and they're talking back and forth, and she has the confidence to talk to him and not be silent.
So it's Hagar, and it's been her for a long time. And I identify with her in a few different ways, but when we think about the story of Hagar, someone who suffered abuse, really, at the hands of Abraham and Sarah. And then she is, she's cast out, and in her being marginalized, in her brokenness, in her being isolated, she finds God in that place. And she's the one, it's not Abraham, it's not Sarah in the story. It's Hagar is the one who declares and actually names who God is. And if I'm recalling right, she is the first person in Scripture who names who God is. God is the one who sees me. God is the one who hears me. And she gives God those names.
Doing the Bible Women's Project, we all had to bring in a story of a woman from the Bible that we were either in love with or we struggled with or we'd never heard of. And I was like, oh my God, I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I was raised with the stories of women in the Bible. We all start with Eve. No way am I going to say Eve's my favorite. So we start with Eve, right? And then, I remember growing up with Lot's wife and being told, oh, Lot's wife, totally went against God, looked back at her home and was turned into a pillar of salt. And we were taught, so this is what you do. As a woman, you should not be sentimental and you should not be, going against what God tells you to do. Potiphar's wife, right? I mean, gets blamed for, almost raping Joseph. Okay. Can we pause and say, how many men have never gotten blamed for all of the rapes that they commit in the Bible, but I was raised definitely being told about Potiphar's wife over and over and over again. Okay, anyway, so I felt like I had all of these examples of bad women in the Old Testament, and I felt like the only really great example of a woman was Mary, which I felt was okay, I mean, yeah, but she also didn't really ask to be in the position she was in. So I struggled with how to answer that question. So when we did the Bible Women's Project, I brought in the woman I had found on my own, and Abigail was my favorite woman in the Bible. And so Abigail's story is that she lives with this abusive husband, and at one point, King David is asking her husband Nabal to give him some wool as a thank you because David's men had protected Nabal's men, and Nabal was like, no. So David decides, okay, well, I'm going to come kill you. I'm going to take your land, and I'm taking your servants, and taking Abigail to be my slave. And Abigail, somebody comes to Abigail, one of her servants, and says, your husband has totally messed this up. David's going to come, he's setting up a whole army against us. And Abigail's like, oh my gosh, my stupid husband. And she's not supposed to leave the house. She's not supposed to do anything that he hasn't commanded her to do. But she just throws all of those rules out the window to sacrifice and save everybody that she can. And she gathers as many provisions as she can get on the back of this donkey. So she runs to meet David's army and stops them in their tracks and apologizes for how stupid her husband is. And David actually turns around and goes home because of her. So what I love about that story is she's in a really bad situation. I grew up in an abusive household, so that was identifiable to me. She's in a really bad situation. She knows that she could probably be beaten by her husband after what she does, and she does it anyway. Also, I feel like God sees her in that moment and says, I'm not going to keep putting you through this. But I just feel like that story is so powerful that we've got this example of this really strong woman who just, her own sheer body stands in front of an army and says, look, this is not what my household did. This is not representative of the servants or the people here. This is my husband and we don't agree with him, but please hear me. And he does. And I just like, what a great story. Like, I could have used that story growing up. It would have been really helpful for me growing up in an abusive household to feel like there was a woman who went directly against these stupid rules that didn't make sense and were very, very hurtful. But I didn't have that. I didn't have that example. You know, I had examples of men that were, you know, faithful and sure and going against their own armies, but I needed an example of a strong woman.
Yeah, I will say what's really interesting is in my time here, I think especially as like the Me Too movement has come to the forefront, I think being a woman myself, that I receive more stories from other people because they trust me with those stories. And so I have found it important to be a person that holds them and protects them, but also kind of lifts those stories up. And to lift up the stories in the Bible in which there's been violence to women, or because that's not those are often stories. Even you usually have favorite stories of women in the Bible, but there's also stories of women in the Bible who have been hurt and abused, and we tend to ignore those. And I think those are just as important to lift up in the way that we've hurt people over the years. But for me, I think women play a really crucial role in the church, and they have, since its like beginnings. I mean, we have women who were the first at the tomb that saw Jesus and the empty tomb, and we have women today that are really active in the church doing really good work.
So I went and I had this interview with this pastor, and they offered the job to me, and they said, but if you don't take this job, I had sent him my resume in school and all that kind of stuff. And I had attended seminary for 1 semester prior to being a missionary. I had to go and take some classes. And he said, if you don't take this job, I think that you need to return to seminary and pursue your call to ministry, because we can see that you're called to ministry. He was sitting there with another pastor. So I didn't take the job. I quit the job at the preschool. And I enrolled full-time at seminary, and I was 43 years old, and I knew I was doing the right thing, and it was God's timing. And I look back at that experience with that first pastor, and I feel like I used the word, it was like I was in an incubator, that God still had so much developing to do in me. I had so much growing that I needed to do. And he took all those years, and I had so many good experiences, being a missionary, being a mother, doing evangelism with neighbors, even teaching, Bible to preschoolers. God just took all of that stuff, and he was preparing me just for this moment when God said it's time to really return to that call.
What's the importance of women's roles in the church? To tell these stories, to see these stories, right? To read 2 Samuel and go, why are we preaching about Abigail? Right? Why aren't we preaching about Michal? Like, Michal's story is really, I'm struck by now. And there's just we ask women to identify with men's stories, or we ask them to believe that they're bad. That's what we get. And I don't think it's because there are bad male preachers. I think it's because there are not enough female preachers. And we need people to be bold enough to tell those stories.